For a number of years, I was a partner in a small commercial laboratory in Monterey. Many strange things happened while we worked, and the following story, which I've called The Snake, happened almost exactly as I've written it. I don't know what it means. The story was finally published, and one of my favorite pieces of fan mail came from a small-town librarian. She said it was the worst story she had ever read anywhere. She was quite upset at its badness. Actually, it isn't a story at all. It's just something that happened, and it goes this way. It was almost dark when young Dr. Phillips swung his sack to his shoulder and left the tide pool. He climbed up over the rocks and squashed along the street in his rubber boots. The street lights were on by the time he arrived at his little commercial laboratory on Cannery Street of Monterey. It was a tight little building, standing partly on piers over the bay and partly on the land. On both sides, the big corrugated iron sardine canneries crowded in on it. Dr. Phillips climbed the wooden steps, opened the door. The white rats in their cages scampered up and down the wire, and the captive cats in their pens mewed for milk. Dr. Phillips turned on the glaring light over the dissection table and dumped his clammy sack on the floor. He walked to the glass cages by the window where the rattlesnakes lived, leaned over and looked in. The snakes were bunched and resting in the corners of the cage, but every head was clear, and the dusty eyes seemed to look at nothing. But as the young man leaned over the cage, the forked tongues, black on the ends and pink behind, twittered out and waved slowly up and down, and then the snakes recognized the man and pulled in their tongues. Dr. Phillips threw off his leather coat, built a fire in the tin stove. He set a kettle of water on the stove and dropped a can of beans into the water. Then he stood staring at the sack on the floor. He was a slight young man with the mild, preoccupied eyes of one who looks through a microscope a great deal, and he wore a short, blond beard. The draft ran breathily up the chimney, and a glow of warmth came from the stove. The little waves washed quietly among the piles under the building. Arranged on the shelves about the room were tier upon tier of museum jars, containing the mounted marine specimens the laboratory dealt in. Dr. Phillips opened a side door, went to his bedroom, a book-lined cell containing an army cot, a reading light, and an uncomfortable wooden chair. He pulled off his rubber boots and put on a pair of sheepskin slippers. When he came back to the other room, the water in the kettle was beginning to hum. He lifted his sack to the table under the white light and emptied out 24 common starfish. These he laid out side by side on the table. His preoccupied eyes turned to the busy rats in the wire cages. Taking grain from a paper sack, he poured it into the feeding trough, and instantly the rats scrambled down from the wire and fell on the food. A bottle of milk stood on a glass shelf between two mounted octopi and a jellyfish. Dr. Phillips lifted down the milk, walked to the cat cage, but before he filled the containers, he reached in the cage and gently picked up a big, rangy alley cat. He stroked her for a moment and then dropped her in a small black painted box, closed the lid and bolted it, and then turned on a petcock, which admitted gas to the killing chamber. While the short, soft struggle went on in the black box, he filled the saucers with milk. One of the cats arched against his hand, and he smiled and petted her neck. The box was quiet now. He turned off the petcock, for the airtight box would be full of gas. On the stove, the pan of water was bubbling furiously about the can of beans. Dr. Phillips lifted out the can with a big pair of forceps, opened it, emptied the beans into a watch glass. While he ate, he looked at the starfish on the table. From between the rays, little drops of milky fluid were exuding. He bolted his beans, and when they were gone, he put the dish in the sink and stepped to the equipment cupboard. From this, he took a microscope and a pile of little glass dishes. He filled the dishes one by one with seawater from a tap and arranged them in a line beside the starfish. He took out his watch, laid it on the table under the pouring white light. The waves washed with little sighs against the piles under the floor. He took an eyedropper from a drawer and bent over the starfish. At that moment, there were quick, soft steps on the wooden stairs and a strong knocking at the door. A grimace of annoyance crossed the young man's face as he went to open. A tall, lean woman stood in the doorway. She was dressed in a severe suit. Her straight black hair, growing low on a flat forehead, was mussed as though the wind had been blowing it. Her black eyes glittered in the strong light. She spoke in a soft, throaty voice. "May I come in? I want to talk to you." "I'm very busy just now," he said half-heartedly. "I have things to do at times." And he stood away from the door. The tall woman slipped in. "I'll be quiet till you can talk to me." He closed the door then, brought the uncomfortable chair from the bedroom. "You see," he apologized, "the process has started and I've got to get to it. So many people wander in and ask questions, and I have to explain the common processes." He could tell them without thinking. "Sit here," he said. "In a few moments I'll be able to listen to you." The tall woman leaned over the table. With the eyedropper, Dr. Phillips gathered fluid from between the rays of the starfish and squirted it into a bowl of the water, and then he drew some milky fluid and squirted it in the same bowl and stirred the water gently with the eyedropper. And he began his little tired patter of explanation. When starfish are sexually mature, they release sperm and ova when they're exposed at low tide. By choosing mature specimens and taking them out of water, I give them a condition of low tide. Now I've mixed sperm and ova. Now I put some of the mixture in each of these 10 watch glasses. In 10 minutes I will kill the first with menthol. 20 minutes later I will kill the second. Then a new group every 20 minutes. When I have finished, I will have arrested the process in stages, and I will mount the series on microscope slides for biologic study. He paused. "Would you like to look at this group under the microscope?" "No, thank you," she said. He turned quickly to her. People always wanted to look through the glass. She wasn't looking at the table at all, but at him. Her black eyes were on him, but they didn't seem to see him. He realized why the irises were as dark as the pupils. There was no color line between the two. Dr. Phillips was piqued at her answer, although answering questions bored him. A lack of interest in what he was doing irritated him. He wanted to arouse her. "While I'm waiting the first 10 minutes, I have something to do. Some people don't like to see it. Maybe you'd better step into that room till I finish." "No," she said in her soft, flat tone. "Do what you wish. I'll wait until you can talk to me." Her hands rested side by side on her lap. She was completely at rest. Her eyes were bright, but the rest of her was almost in a state of suspended animation. He thought, low metabolic rate, almost as low as a frog's from the looks. And the desire to shock her out of her inanition possessed him again. He brought a little wooden cradle to the table, laid out scalpels and scissors, and rigged a big hollow needle to a pressure tube. Then from the killing chamber he brought the limp dead cat, laid it on the cradle, and tied its legs to the hooks on the sides. He glanced sideways at the woman. She had not moved. She was still at rest. The cat grinned into the light. Its pink tongue stuck out between its needle teeth. Dr. Phillips deftly snipped open the skin at the throat. With a scalpel, he cut through and found an artery. With flawless technique, he put the needle in the vessel, tied it with gut. "Embalming fluid," he explained. "Later I'll inject yellow mass into the venous system and red mass into the arterial system for bloodstream dissection." Low biology classes. He looked around at her again. Her dark eyes seemed veiled with dust. She looked without expression at the cat's open throat. Not a drop of blood had escaped. The incision was clean. Dr. Phillips looked at his watch. "It's time for the first group." He shook a few crystals of menthol into the first watch glass. The woman was making him very nervous. The rats climbed about on the wire of their cages and squeaked softly. The waves under the building beat with little shocks on the piles. The young man shivered. He put a few lumps of coal in the stove and sat down. "Now," he said, "I haven't anything to do for 20 minutes. He noticed how short her chin was between upper lip and point. She seemed to awaken slowly, to come out of some deep pool of consciousness. Her head raised, and her dark, dusty eyes moved about the room and came back to him. "I was waiting," she said, and her hands remained side by side on her lap. "You have snakes?" "Why, yes," he said rather loudly. "I have 24 rattlesnakes. I milk out the venom and send it to the anti-venom laboratories." She continued to look at him, but her eyes did not center on him. Rather, they covered him, and seemed to see in a big circle all around him. "Have you a male snake, a male rattlesnake?" "Well, it just happens I know I have. I came in one morning and found a big snake in coition with a smaller one. That's very rare in captivity. You see, I do know I have a male snake." "Where is he?" "Why, right in the glass cage by the window there." Her head swung slowly around, but her two quiet hands did not move. She turned back to him. "May I see?" He got up and walked to the case by the window. In the sand bottom of the cage, a knot of rattlesnakes lay entwined, but their heads stuck out clear. The tongues came out, flicked a moment, and waved up and down, feeling the air for vibrations. Dr. Phillips nervously turned his head. The woman was standing beside him. He had not heard her get up from her chair. He had heard only the splash of water among the piles and the scampering of rats. She said softly, "Which is the snake you spoke of?" He pointed to a thick, dusty gray snake lying by itself in one corner of the cage. "That one. He's nearly 5 feet long. He comes from Texas. Our Pacific Coast snakes are usually smaller. He's been taking all the rats, too. When I want the others to eat, I have to take him out." The woman stared down at the blunt, dry head. The forked tongue slipped out and hung and quivered for a long moment. "And you're sure he's a male?" "Rattlesnakes are funny," he said glibly. "Nearly every generalization proves wrong. I don't like to say anything definite about rattlesnakes, but yes, I can assure you he's a male." Her eyes did not move from the flat head. "Will you sell him to me?" "Sell him," he said. "Sell him to you. You do sell specimens, don't you?" "Oh, yes, yes, of course I do. Of course I do." "How much? $5? 10? "Oh, not more than 5. But do you know anything about rattlesnakes? You might be bitten." She looked at him for a moment. "I don't intend to take him. I want to leave him here. But I want him to be mine. I want to come here and look at him and feed him and know he's mine." She opened a little purse and took out a $5 bill. "Here, now he's mine." Dr. Phillips began to be afraid. "You could come in and look at him without owning him." "I want him to be mine," she said. "Oh, Lord," he cried, "I've forgotten the time." And he ran to the table. 3 minutes over. "It won't matter much," he said. And he shook menthol crystals into the second watch glass. And then he was drawn back to the cage, where the woman still stared at the snake. She asked, "What does he eat?" "I feed them white rats. Rats from the cage over there." "Will you put him in the other cage?" "I want to feed him." "He doesn't need food. He's had a rat already this week. Sometimes I don't eat for 3 or 4 months. I had one that didn't eat for over a year." In her low monotone, she asked, "Will you sell me a rat?" He shrugged his shoulders. "I see. You want to watch how rattlesnakes eat. All right, I'll show you. The rat will cost 25 cents. It's better than a bullfight if you look at it one way, and it's simply a snake eating his dinner if you look at it another way." His tone had become acid. He hated people who made a sport of natural processes. He was not a sportsman. He could kill 1,000 animals for knowledge, but not an insect for pleasure. He'd been over this in his mind before. She turned her head slowly toward him, and the beginning of a smile formed on her thin lips. "I want to feed my snake," she said. "I'll put him in the other cage." She had opened the top of the cage and dipped her hand in before he knew what she was doing. He leaped forward and pulled her back, and the lid banged shut. "Haven't you any sense?" he said fiercely. "Maybe he wouldn't kill you, but he'd make you damn sick in spite of what I could do for you." "You put him in the other cage, then," she said quietly. Dr. Phillips was shaken. He found that he was avoiding the dark eyes that didn't seem to look at anything. He felt it was profoundly wrong to put a rat into the cage, deeply sinful, and he didn't know why. Often he'd put rats in the cage when someone or other had wanted to see it, but this desire tonight sickened him. He tried to explain himself out of it. "It's a good thing to see," he said. "It shows you how a snake can work. It makes you have respect for a rattlesnake. Then, too, lots of people have dreams about the terror of snakes making the kill. I think because it is a subjective rat. The person is the rat. Once you see it, the whole matter is objective. The rat is only a rat, and the terror is removed." He took a long stick equipped with a leather noose from the wall, opened the trap, dropped the noose over the big snake's head, and tightened the thong. A piercing, dry rattle filled the room. The thick body writhed and slashed about the handle of the stick as he lifted the snake out and dropped it in the feeding cage. It stood ready to strike for a time, but the buzzing gradually ceased, and the snake crawled into a corner, made a big figure 8 with its body, and lay still. "You see," Dr. Phillips explained, "these snakes are quite tame. I've had them a long time. I suppose I could handle them if I wanted to, but everyone who does handle rattlesnakes gets bitten sooner or later. I just don't want to take the chance." He glanced at the woman. He hated to put in a rat. She'd moved over in front of the new cage, and her black eyes were on the stony head of the snake again. She said, "Put in a rat." Reluctantly, he went to the rat cage. He was sorry for the rat, and such a feeling had never come to him before. His eyes went over the mass of swarming white bodies climbing up the screen. Which one, he thought, which one should it be? And suddenly he turned angrily to the woman. "Wouldn't you rather I put in a cat? Then you'd see a real fight. A cat might even win. But if it did, it might kill the snake. I'll sell you a cat if you like." She didn't look at him, put in a rat. She said, I want to see him eat. He opened the rat cage and thrust his hand in, and his fingers found a tail. He lifted a plump, red-eyed rat out of the cage, struggled up to try to bite his fingers, and failing, hung spread out and motionless from its tail. He walked quickly across the room, opened the feeding cage, and dropped the rat on the sand floor. Now watch it, he cried. The woman didn't answer. Her eyes were on the snake, where it lay still, its tongue flicking in and out rapidly, tasting the air of the cage. The rat landed on his feet, turned around, sniffed at its pink naked tail, and then unconcernedly trotted across the sand, smelling as it went. The room was silent. Dr. Phillips did not know whether the water sighed among the piles or whether the woman sighed. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her body crouch and stiffen. The snake moved out smoothly, slowly. The tongue flicked in and out. The motion was so gradual, so smooth, that it didn't seem to be motion at all. In the other end of the cage, the rat perked up a little in a sitting position and began to lick down the fine white hair on his chest. The snake moved on, keeping always an S-curve in its neck. The silence beat on the young man. He felt the blood drifting up in his body. He said loudly, See, he keeps the striking curve ready. Rattlesnakes are cautious, almost cowardly. The mechanism is so delicate. The snake's dinner is to be got by an operation as deft as a surgeon's job. He takes no chances with his instruments. The snake had flowed to the middle of the cage by now. The rat looked up and saw the snake, and then unconcernedly went back to licking its chest. It's the most beautiful thing in the world, the young man said, and his veins were throbbing. It's the most terrible thing in the world. The snake was very close now. Its head lifted a few inches from the sand. The head weaved slowly back and forth, aiming, getting distance, and aiming. Dr. Phillips glanced again at the woman, and he turned sick, for she was weaving too, or just slightly weaving. The rat looked up and saw the snake. It dropped on 4 feet and backed up. And then the stroke. It was impossible to see, simply a flash. The rat jarred as though under an invisible blow. The snake backed hurriedly away into the corner from which it had come and settled down, its tongue working constantly. Perfect, Dr. Phillips cried, right between the shoulder blades. The fang must almost have reached the heart. Now the rat stood still, breathing, like a little white bellows. And suddenly it leaped in the air and landed on its side, and its legs kicked spasmodically a second, and it was dead. The woman relaxed sleepily. Well, the young man demanded, it was an emotional bath, wasn't it? She turned her dusty eyes to him. Will he eat it now, she asked. Of course he'll eat it. He didn't kill it for a thrill. He killed it because he was hungry. The corners of the woman's mouth turned up a trifle again, and she looked at the snake. I want to see him eat it. Now the snake came out of its corner again. There was no striking curve in its neck, but it approached the rat gingerly, ready to jump back in case it attacked. It nudged the body gently with its blunt nose and drew away. Finally, satisfied that it was dead, the snake touched the body all over with his chin, from head to tail. It seemed to measure the body and to kiss it. Finally, it opened its mouth and unhinged its jaws at the corners. Dr. Phillips put his will against his head to keep it from turning toward the woman. He thought, if she's opening her mouth, I'll be sick. I'll be afraid. And he succeeded in keeping his eyes away from her. The snake fitted its jaws over the rat's head, and then, with a slow peristaltic pulsing, began to engulf the rat. The jaws gripped, and the whole throat crawled up, and the jaws gripped again. Dr. Phillips turned away and went to his work table. You've made me miss one of the series, he said bitterly. The set won't be complete. He put the watch glasses under the low-power microscope and looked at it. And then angrily he poured the contents of all the dishes in the sink. The waves had fallen so that only a wet whisper came up from the floor. The young man lifted a trapdoor at his feet and dropped the starfish down into the black water. He paused at the cat, crucified on the cradle, and grinning comically into the light. His body was puffed with embalming fluid. He shut off the pressure, withdrew the needle, and tied the vein. Would you like some coffee, he asked. No, thank you. I shall be going pretty soon. He walked to her, where she stood in front of the snake cage. The rat was swallowed, all except an inch of pink tail that stuck out of the snake's mouth like a sardonic tongue. The throat heaved again, and the tail disappeared. The jaws snapped back in their sockets, and the big snake crawled heavily into a corner, made a big figure 8, and dropped its head on the sand. He's asleep now, the woman said. I'm going now. But I'll come back and I'll feed my snake every little while. I'll pay for the rats. I want him to have plenty. Sometime I'll take him away with me." Her eyes came out of their dusty dream for a moment. "Remember, he's mine. Don't take his poison. I want him to have it. Good night." She walked swiftly to the door and went out. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, but he could not hear her walk away on the pavement. Dr. Phillips turned a chair around and sat down in front of the snake cage. He tried to comb out his thought as he looked at the torpid snake. "I've read so much about psychological sex symbols," he thought. "It doesn't seem to explain. Maybe I'm too much alone. Maybe I should kill the snake. If I knew... No, I can't pray to anything." For weeks he expected her to return. "I'll go out and leave her alone when she comes back," he decided. "I won't see that damned thing again." But she never came again. For months he looked for her when he walked about in the town. Several times he ran after a tall woman, thinking it might be she, but he never saw her again, ever. This is a story about a monster named Johnny Bear. He really lived in Central California. I knew him. He caused a great deal of trouble before he was through. The village of Loma is built, as its name implies, on a low, round hill that rises like an island out of the flat mouth of the Salinas Valley in Central California. To the north and east of the town, a black tule swamp stretches for miles, but to the south, the marsh has been drained. Rich vegetable land has been the result of the draining, and the lettuce and cauliflowers grow to be giants. The owners of the swamp to the north of the village began to covet the black land. They banded together and formed a reclamation district. I worked for a company that took the contract to put a ditch through. The floating clamshell dredger arrived, was put together, and started eating a ditch of open water through the swamp. There aren't more than 200 people in Loma. The Methodist Church has the highest place on the hill. Its spire is visible for miles. 2 groceries, a hardware store, an ancient Masonic hall, and the Buffalo Bar, and that's Loma. On the side of the hills are the small wooden houses of the population, and on the rich southern flats are the houses of the landowners. Small yards, usually enclosed by high walls of clipped cypress to keep out the driving afternoon winds. There was nothing to do in Loma in the evening except to go to the saloon, an old board building with swinging doors and a wooden sidewalk awning. Neither Prohibition nor Repeal had changed its business, its clientele, nor the quality of its whiskey. In the course of an evening, every male inhabitant of Loma, over 15 years old, came at least once to the Buffalo Bar, had a drink, and talked a while, and went home. Fat Carl, the owner and bartender, greeted every newcomer with a phlegmatic sullenness which nevertheless inspired familiarity and affection. His face was sour, his tone downright unfriendly. And yet, I don't know how he did it. I know I felt gratified and warm when Fat Carl knew me well enough to turn his pig face to me and say with impatience, "What's it going to be?" He always asked that, although he served only whiskey and only one kind of whiskey. I've seen him flatly refuse to squeeze some lemon juice into it for a stranger. Fat Carl didn't like fumadiddles. He wore a big towel tied around his middle, and he polished the glasses on it as he moved about. The floor was bare wood, sprinkled with sawdust, the bar an old store counter, and the chairs hard and straight. The only decorations were the posters and cards and pictures stuck to the wall by candidates for county elections, salesmen and auctioneers. Some of these were many years old. The card of Sheriff Rittel still begged for re-election, although Rittel had been dead for 7 years. Buffalo Bar sounds even to me like a terrible place, but when you walked down the night street over the wooden sidewalks, when the long streamers of swamp fog like waving dirty bunting slapped in your face, and when finally you pushed open the swinging doors of Fat Carl's and saw men sitting around talking and drinking, and Fat Carl coming along toward you, it seemed pretty nice. At least you couldn't get away from it. There'd be a game of the mildest kind of poker going on. Timothy Ratz would be playing solitaire, cheating pretty badly because he took a drink only when he got it out. I've seen him get it out 5 times in a row. When he won, he piled the cards neatly, stood up, and walked with great dignity to the bar. Fat Carl, with a glass half filled before he arrived, asked, "What'll it be?" "Whiskey," said Timothy gravely. In the long room, men from the farms and the town sat in the straight, hard chairs or stood against the wall counter. A soft, monotonous rattle of conversation went on, except at times of elections or prize fights, when there might be orations or loud opinions. Soon after my arrival in Loma, I scraped acquaintance with May Romero, a pretty half-Mexican girl. Sometimes in the evenings I walked with her down to the south of the hill until the nasty fog drove us back into town. After I escorted her home, I dropped in at the bar for a while. I was sitting in the bar one night talking to Alex Hartnell, who owned a nice little farm. We were talking about bass fishing when the front door opened and swung closed. A hush fell on the men in the room. Alex nudged me and said, "It's Johnny Bear." His name described him better than I can. He looked like a great stupid smiling bear. His black matted head bobbed forward and his long arms hung out as though he had been on all fours and was only standing upright as a trick. His legs were short and bowed and ended with strange square feet. He was dressed in dark blue denim, but his feet were bare. They didn't seem to be crippled or deformed in any way, but they were just squares, wide as they were long. He stood in the doorway swinging his arms, the way half-wits do. On his face was a foolish, happy smile. He moved forward. For all his bulk and clumsiness, he seemed to creep. He didn't move like a man, but like a bear. At the bar he stopped, and his little eyes went about from face to face, and he said, "Whiskey, whiskey for Johnny?" Loma was not a treating town. A man might buy a drink for another if he were pretty sure the other would immediately buy one for him. I was surprised when one of the quiet men slid a coin down the counter. Fat Carl filled a glass. The monster took it and gulped the whiskey. "What the devil?" I began, and Alex nudged me and said, "Shh." There began a curious pantomime. Johnny Bear moved to the door, and then he came creeping back. The smile never left his face. In the middle of the room, he crouched down on his stomach, and a voice came from his throat. The voice seemed familiar to me. "You are too beautiful to live in a dirty little town like this." The voice rose to a soft, throaty tone with just a trace of accent in the words. "You just tell me that." I nearly fainted. It was my own voice coming out of the throat of Johnny Bear. My own words, my own intonation. And then it was the voice of May Romero, exact. If I'd not seen the crouching man on the floor, I would have called to her. And the dialogue went on. These things sound silly when somebody else says them. Johnny Bear went right on, or rather, I should say, I went right on. And he said things and made sounds. Gradually, the faces of the men turned from Johnny Bear and turned toward me, and they grinned at me. And I couldn't do anything. I knew if I tried to stop him, I'd have a fight on my hands, so the scene went on to a finish. And when it was over, I was awfully glad May Romero had no brothers. I think the men in the bar were sorry for me. They looked away from me and talked elaborately to one another. Johnny Bear went to the back of the room, crawled under a round card table, curled up like a dog, and went to sleep. Alex Hartnell was regarding me with compassion. "First time you ever heard him?" "Yes, what in hell is he?" Alex ignored my question for a moment. "If you're worrying about May's reputation, don't. Johnny Bear's followed May before." "But how did he hear us? I didn't see him." "No one sees or hears Johnny Bear when he's on business. He can move like no movement at all. You know what our young men do when they go out with girls? They take a dog. Dogs are afraid of Johnny. They can smell him coming." "But good God, those voices." Alex said, "I know. Some of us rode up to the university about Johnny. Young man came down, took a look, and he told us about Blind Tom. Did you ever hear of Blind Tom?" "No, I haven't." "Well, Blind Tom was a Negro half-wit. He could hardly talk, but he could imitate anything he heard on the piano, long pieces. They tried him with musicians, and he reproduced not only the music, but every little personal emphasis. To catch him, they made little mistakes, and he played the mistakes. He photographed the playing in the tiniest detail. The man says Johnny Bear's the same, only he photographs words and voices. He tested Johnny with a passage in Greek, and Johnny did it exactly. He doesn't know the words he's saying, he just says them. He hasn't brains enough to make anything up, so you know what he says is true. Why does he do it? Why is he interested in listening if he doesn't understand?" "He isn't," said Alex. "He loves whiskey. He knows if he listens in windows and comes and repeats what he hears, somebody will give him whiskey." I said, "It's funny somebody hadn't shot him while he was peeking in the window." Alex picked up his cigarette. "Lots of people have tried, but they just don't see Johnny Bear. You can't catch him. You keep your windows closed, and even then you talk in a whisper if you don't want to be repeated. You were lucky it was dark tonight. If he'd seen you, he might have gone through the action." I looked at the sprawled figure under the table. The light fell on his black matted hair. I saw a big fly land on his head, and then I swear I saw the whole scalp shiver the way the skin of a horse shivers when a fly lands on it. The fly landed again, and the moving scalp shook it off again. Conversation in the room had settled to a bored monotone. Alex beside me said, "Have a drink." We walked to the counter, and Fat Carl put out 2 glasses. What'll it be? Carl's head twitched back toward the card table. He got you, didn't he? I winked at him. I'll take a dog next time. Johnny Bear rolled over on his stomach. His face looked out at the room. And he came sliding out like an animal. Whiskey? Whiskey? It was like a bird call. Whiskey? The conversation in the room started, but nobody came forward with money. Johnny Bear smiled plaintively. Whiskey? And then he tried to cozen them. Out of his throat, an angry woman's voice issued. I tell you, it was all bone. 20 cents a pound and all bone. And the man, yes, ma'am, I didn't know it. I'll give you some sausage to make it up. Whiskey? But none of the men offered to come forward. Johnny crept to the front of the room and crouched. I said, what's he doing? Alex said, shh. A woman's voice came, a cold, sure voice. The words clipped. I don't understand it. Are you some kind of monster? I wouldn't have believed if I hadn't seen you. And another woman's voice answered her, a voice low and hoarse. Maybe I am a monster. I can't help it. You must help it, the cold voice broke in. You'd be better dead. A soft sobbing came from the thick, smiling lips of Johnny Bear. All the men were stiff and listening. The sobbing stopped. Haven't you ever felt that way, Emmeline? The cold voice announced, certainly not. Never in the night, never, ever in your life? If I had, said the cold voice, if I ever had, I'd cut that part of me away. Stop your whining, Amy. I won't stand it. Go to your prayers. Johnny Bear smiled on and said, whiskey? He smiled at the room, and then he went out with that creeping gait of his. Conversation didn't spring up again. Everyone in the room seemed to have a problem to settle in his own mind. One by one, they drifted out, and the backswing of the doors brought in little puffs of tule fog. Alex got up and walked out, and I followed him. The night was nasty with fog. It seemed to cling to the buildings, to reach out with free arms into the air. I doubled my pace and caught up with Alex. What is it? I demanded. What is all that about? For a moment I thought he wouldn't answer, but then he stopped and he turned to me. Oh, damn it, listen. Every town has its aristocrats. Its family above reproach. Emmeline and Amy Hawkins are our aristocrats. Their father was a congressman. I don't know why Johnny does this. They feed him. We shouldn't give him whiskey. I asked, are they relatives of yours? No, but they aren't like other people. They have the farm next to mine. 2 maiden ladies, some Chinese farm it on shares. Why, the Hawkins women, they're symbols. They're what we tell our kids when we want to describe good people. Well, I protested. Nothing Johnny Bear said would hurt them, would it? I don't know. I'm going to bed, he said. About 8 the next morning, I walked down across the swamp to the dredger. The crew was busy bending some new wire to the drums and coiling the worn cable for removal. I looked over the job and at 11 o'clock walked back to Loma. In front of Mrs. Ratt's boarding house, Alex Hartnell sat in a Model T Ford touring car. He called to me. I was just going out to the dredger to get you. I knocked off a couple of chickens this morning. Thought you might like to come and help with them. I accepted joyfully. As we drove along the road, Alex shouted, remember about the Hawkinses? Of course I remember. He pointed ahead. That's their house. Little of the house could be seen, for a high, thick hedge of cypress surrounded it. It must be a small garden inside the square, too. Only the roof and the tops of the windows showed over the hedge. I could see the house was painted tan, trimmed with dark brown, a combination favored for railroad stations and schools in California. There were 2 wicket gates in front and side of the hedge. The hedge was clipped square, and it looked strong and thick. It keeps the wind out, Alex shouted. Doesn't keep Johnny Bear out, I said. He waved at a whitewashed square building standing out in the field. That's where the Chink sharecroppers live. At that moment, from behind the corner of the hedge, a horse and buggy turned into the road. The gray horse was old but well-groomed, and the buggy shiny and the harness polished. There was a big silver H on the outside of each blinder. It seemed to me that the check rein was too short for such an old horse. Alex said, there they are now, on their way to church. We took off our hats and bowed to the women as they went by, and they nodded formally to us. I had a good look at them. They looked almost exactly as I thought they would. Johnny Bear was more monstrous than I had known, if by the tone of voice he could describe the features of people. I didn't have to ask which was Emmeline, which was Amy. The clear, straight eyes, the sharp chin, the mouth cut with the precision of a diamond, the stiff, curveless figure, that was Emmeline. Amy was very like her, but unlike. Her edges were soft, her eyes were warm, and her mouth full, and there was a swell to her breast, and yet she did look like Emmeline. But whereas Emmeline's mouth was straight by nature, Amy held her mouth straight. Emmeline must have been 50 or 55, and Amy maybe 10 years younger. I had only a moment to look at them, and I never saw them again. A place like Loma, with its fogs, with its great swamp, like a hideous sin, really needed the Hawkins women. I could see that. It was a good dinner at Alex's. His sister fried the chicken in butter and did everything else right. And we sat around in the dining room and drank really good brandy. I said, I don't see why we ever go to the Buffalo. That whiskey is... I know it is, said Alex, but the Buffalo is the mind of Loma. It's a newspaper. It's our club. This was so true that when Alex started the Ford and prepared to take me back, I knew and he knew that we would go for an hour or two to the Buffalo Bar. We were nearly into town. The feeble lights of the car splashed about on the road. Another car rattled toward us, and Alex swung across the road and stopped. It's Dr. Holmes, he explained. The oncoming car pulled up because it couldn't get around us. Alex called, Say, Doc, I was going to ask you to take a look at my sister. She's got a swelling on her throat. Dr. Holmes called back, All right, Alex, I'll take a look, but pull out, will you? I'm in a hurry. Alex was delivered. Who's sick, Doc? Why, Miss Amy had a little spell. Get out of the way, will you? We drove on. I was about to remark that the night was clear, when looking ahead I saw rags of fog creeping around the hill from the swamp side and climbing like slow snakes on top of Loma. The Ford shuddered to a stop in front of the Buffalo, and we went in. Fat Carl moved toward us, wiping a glass, and he reached under the bar for the nearby bottle. What'll it be, he asked. Whiskey. For a moment a smile seemed to flit on his sullen, fat face. The room was full. My dredger crew was there, even. But it was the quietest bar I ever saw. Somehow the sullen, baleful eyes of Fat Carl made drinking a quiet, efficient business. Timothy Ratz was playing solitaire at one of the round tables. The doors unfolded silently, and Johnny Bear crept in. His square feet were like cat's feet. Whiskey, he chirped, and no one encouraged him. He went down on his stomach the way he had got me, and sing-song nasal words came out. Chinese, I thought. And then it seemed to me that the same words were repeated in another voice, slower, not nasally. Johnny Bear raised his shaggy head and he asked, Whiskey? I slid a quarter along the bar and Johnny gulped his drink. And the chill voice of Emmeline said, She's in here, Doctor. She's had a fainting fit. Yes, Doctor. There was a little pause, and then the doctor's voice, very softly. Why did she do it, Emmeline? Why did she do what? I'm your doctor, Emmeline. I was your father's doctor. Don't you think I've seen that kind of mark before? How long was she hanging? There was a longer pause then, and the chill left the woman's voice. 2 or 3 minutes. Will she be all right? Oh, yes, she'll come around. Why did she do it? The answering voice was even colder than it had been at first. I don't know, sir. You mean you won't tell me? I mean what I say. And the doctor's voice went on, giving directions for treatment, rest, milk, and a little whiskey. Above all, be gentle, he said. Be gentle with her. Emmeline's voice trembled a little. You would never tell, Doctor? Of course I won't tell. I'll send you some sedatives. Whiskey, and my eyes jerked open, and there was the horrible Johnny Bear smiling around the room. The next morning, when those series of accidents so common in construction landed on us, one of the new wires parted on the in-swing and dropped the bucket on one of the pontoons, sinking it and the works in 8 feet of ditch water. When we dropped a dead man and got a line out to it to pull us from the water, the line parted and clipped the legs neatly off one of the deckhands. We bound the stumps and rushed him to Salinas. My contact with the social life of Loma went to pot for a while, but when the bucket was banging in the mud again and the big diesel was chuttering away in the swamp, I walked up to Alex Hartnell's farm one night. Passing the Hawkins place, I peered in through one of the little wicket gates in the cypress hedge. The house was dark, more dark, because a low light glowed in one window. There was a gentle wind that night, blowing balls of fog like tumbleweeds along the ground. I walked in the clear a moment, and then was swallowed in the mist. And then it was clear again. In the starlight, I could see the silver fog balls moving like elementals across the fields. When I came suddenly out of the fog, I saw a dark figure hurrying along in the field, and I knew from the dragging footsteps it must be one of the Chinese field hands, walking in sandals. Alex seemed glad to see me. His sister was away. I sat down at his stove, and he brought out a bottle of that nice brandy. I heard you were having some trouble, he said. Yeah, the men have got figured out accidents come in groups of 3, 5, 7, and 9. Alex nodded. I feel that way myself. How are the Hawkins sisters, I asked. He didn't want to talk about them, and at the same time he wanted to talk about them. I stepped over about a week ago. Miss Amy isn't feeling very well. I didn't see her. I only saw Miss Emmeline. You almost seem to be related to them, I said. Well, their father and my father were friends. We called the girls Aunt Amy and Aunt Emmeline. They can't do anything bad. It wouldn't be good for any of us if the Hawkins sisters weren't the Hawkins sisters. The community conscience, I asked. The safe thing, he said. A place where a kid can get gingerbread. They believe in the things we hope are true, and they live as though honesty really is the best policy, and charity really is its own reward. And he said, Miss Emmeline is fighting something, and I don't think she's going to win. What do you mean? I don't know what I mean. Oh, I should shoot Johnny Bear and throw him in the swamp. It's not his fault. I walked back to Loma. It seemed to me that the fog was clinging to the cypress hedge of the Hawkins house, and it seemed to me also that a lot of the fog balls were clustered about it, and others were moving slowly in. In the evening of the second day after my visit to Alex, I walked down the wooden sidewalk, trailing a streamer of fog behind me, and went into the Buffalo Bar. Fat Carl came toward me, and I cried whiskey before he had a chance to ask what it would be. I took my glass and went to one of the straight chairs. Alex was not there. At about 10 o'clock, the news came. Miss Amy had committed suicide. She'd hanged herself. The swinging doors opened slowly, and there was Johnny Bear creeping in. And he said, whiskey, whiskey for Johnny. Fat Carl poured him a drink quickly, and Johnny Bear gulped it. The doctor's tone was harsh. Where is she, Emmeline? I've never heard a voice like the one that answered. Cold control, layer and layer of control. She's in here, Doctor. A long pause. She was hanging quite a while. I don't know how long, Doctor. Why did she do it, Emmeline? The monotone again. I don't know, Doctor. A longer pause, and then, Emmeline, did you know she was going to have a baby? Yes, Doctor. Is that why you didn't find her for so long? No, Emmeline, I didn't mean that. Can you make out a certificate without mentioning it? Of course I can. I'll speak to the undertaker, too. Thank you, Doctor. And whiskey for Johnny, whiskey. Fat Carl poured another glass, and Johnny Bear drank it, and then crept to the back of the room and crawled under a table and went to sleep. No one spoke. The men moved up to the bar and laid down their coins silently. They looked bewildered, for a system had fallen. A few minutes later, Alex came into the silent room, and he walked quickly over to me. You heard, he said softly. Yes. I said, did you know she was pregnant? Alex stiffened. He looked around the room and then back at me. Johnny Bear, he asked. I nodded. Alex ran his palm over his eyes. I don't believe it. I was about to answer when I heard a little scuffle and looked to the back of the room and saw Johnny Bear crawl like a badger out of his hole. He came to the bar. Whiskey, he said, and he smiled expectantly at Fat Carl. Then Alex stepped out, and he said, now you guys listen. I've had enough of this. I don't want any more of it. Whiskey for Johnny? Alex turned on the idiot. You ought to be ashamed. Miss Amy gave you food. She gave you all the clothes you ever had. And Johnny smiled at him and said, whiskey? He got out his tricks, and I heard again the sing-song nasal language that sounded like Chinese. Alex looked relieved. And then the other voice, slow, hesitant, repeating the words, but without the nasal quality. Alex moved so quickly I didn't see him move. He splashed his fist into Johnny Bear's smiling mouth. Johnny Bear recovered his balance. His lips were split, but the smile was still there. His arms enfolded Alex as the tentacles of an anemone enfold a crab. Alex bent backward. I jumped in and grabbed one of the arms and wrenched at it, but couldn't tear it loose, and Fat Carl came rolling over the counter with a bung starter in his hand. He beat the matted head until the arms relaxed, and Johnny Bear crumpled. I helped Alex to a chair, and I asked, are you hurt? He tried to get his breath. My back's wrenched, I guess, he said. I'll drive you home. Neither of us looked at the Hawkins place as we went by. I got Alex to his own dark house and helped him to bed and poured a hot brandy into him. He hadn't spoken all the way home. But after he was propped in bed, he said, you don't think anyone noticed, do you? I caught him in time, didn't I? What are you talking about? Why'd you hit him? Well, listen, he said, I'll have to stay close for a little while with this back. But if you hear anyone say anything, stop it. Don't let it go. Don't let them say it. I don't know what you're talking about. He looked at me for a long moment. And he said, well, you know that second voice? That was Miss Amy.